Um, so quickly introducing them. My name is David Hagerty, for those of you who don't know. I manage the Disability Support Services Office at DVC, both at the Pleasant Hill and San Ramon campus. And I'm going to do a short introduction for our guest speaker today. This event coincides with something at the San Ramon Campus Library, a display of banners documenting the history of the disability justice movement, starting from the 1960s and going up to the present day. And let me show you briefly a quick photo of what that looks like. There you are, if you haven't seen it yet. I encourage everyone to step out. It's going to be at the San Ramon Library through the end of the semester. It started last semester at the Pleasant Hill Library, and then we've transitioned it down to our other campus. And as always, I want to give a lot of credit and thanks to several of my coworkers who were really instrumental in creating the project, including Irene Swain down at San Ramon, Lawrence Orm, who assisted a lot with many of the photos, and Carrie Million, who assisted me with a lot of the content.
Oh, that's cool.
Briefly, for those of you who don't know much about the history, the struggle for disability justice followed a very similar timeline and trajectory for that for African Americans, for women, and for the LGBTQIA community. Starting in the 1960s and 70s,
Look at this for you.
activists organized protests and sit-ins nationwide that culminated in the passage of a landmark law in 1973 called Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. It was the first legal protection in this country for people with
Oh,
disabilities.
very nice. Where is that?
However,
At the San Ramon Library, campus library.
4 years passed between that and its implementation, which resulted in the largest and most impactful protest of the disability justice movement, the occupation of a federal building in downtown San Francisco for 25 days during April of 1977. Some of those activists had complex and serious medical conditions, and they risked their lives by foregoing medical care during the occupation to pressure the U.S. government into implementing Section 504. It remains the longest nonviolent takeover of a federal building in U.S. history. Our speaker today, Anthony Tusler, was at that protest and took photographs of it, one of which we have included in the timeline, and I will try to display that for you as well.
I've got a copy in my...
Oh, do you want to do that one?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll be happy to.
In that case, let me just hand it off to you then.
All righty.
Anthony Tusler is a longtime disability activist, writer, and artist. He also started the disability office at Sonoma State University in 1975 and ran it for 22 years. And with that, I give you Anthony Tusler.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really pleased these days that we're talking about social justice, disability justice, and using those kind of terms, because that's really been what's excited me for the past, oh, good Lord, 45, almost 50 years. I'm 77 years old, had a disability since I was 5 years old. And before I get too far into that, what you're looking at here on my screen is a shot that I took of the demonstration at the federal building in San Francisco. The federal building there is on the right, and then dead center is the San Francisco City Hall, which is kind of in the background. And in the foreground is a guy with a sign that says, "We shall overcome." And that guy is Steve Diaz, who I will talk about him in a bit. He was instrumental in my becoming involved in the disability rights movement. So I was injured, had a spinal cord injury in 1952. I'm a baby boomer. You know, I came of age in the 1950s and 60s. Oh, there's so many directions I could go. I'm sorry for hesitating there. Now, I've been thinking about this presentation and going, well, I could talk about this or I could talk about that. So anyway, in 1952, I got a spinal cord injury, and I never knew another disabled person until I met Steve Diaz, until I was 25 years old. So I spent 20 years as a disabled person trying to figure out who and what I was as a disabled person, and not having the language for it, not having the concepts for it. And so I really didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. I was mainstreamed. My disability was such that I could use braces and crutches to get around. So that meant that I could go to regular elementary school, junior high, high school. And it was very isolating. I mean, it was to have a disability, to be that much different than everybody else was really hard. I don't recommend it. I mean, to have an identity that is so far out of the mainstream, but I pretended it wasn't. And that was the problem, is that I was different, but to get through, I had to pretend I wasn't different. And so I spent a whole lot of energy pretending I wasn't different and trying to be just like everybody else, and fooling myself a lot of the time of thinking that I, really wasn't that much different. And in many ways, I'm not. I mean, disability is like a lot of identities, in that so I have so much in common with people without disabilities, much more so than the differences that disability creates. I mean, it's similar to the other marginalized groups, where there's our experience is that of a multifaceted group that is different and yet in many ways the same. I mean, I wanted to get an education. I wanted to be able to be self-supporting. I wanted to get married. I wanted to have girlfriends. Being straight, I wanted to have girlfriends. And in many ways wanted what everybody else did, but I couldn't walk. So I'm talking about this because I think it's important in terms of how we figure out who we are. Because one of the things that the women's movement taught me was the personal is political. My personal experience as a disabled person has political ramifications. And it took me a long time to figure that out. And it took me a long time to become comfortable with it even. I mean, I find it fascinating that, thinking about it this morning, it's what am I going to say to you guys? And, part of what, boy, that thought just went away. Oh, we'll get back to it. So, I know what it was. It was that one of the things that I thought of and thought about when I first got involved in the disability rights movement was I said it seriously, well, I'm not discriminated against, and it was, I couldn't use mass transit if I was using my wheelchair. I would have had a hard time getting a job. I mean, there's all these ways that I was in fact discriminated against, but for me to get through the world was to pretend that I wasn't, and to pretend that I was, air quotes, normal. And so I came up here to Sonoma State actually, I'd give you a little more background. So I grew up in a household, a liberal household. We were explicitly non-racist, even though we had a lot of biases. You know, in the 50s and 60s, we didn't know that much about as much as we know to race. Um, I was homophobic, though. That was all right back in the 50s to be homophobic. Probably ageist, certainly classist. I mean, that's actually the ism that I have to deal with more than anything else is my classism. Well, actually, no. The ism that I have to deal with more than anything else is my ableism. I grew up in a culture where I have prejudices about disabled people, about my brothers and sisters. And there are times when that crops up, you know, and I have stereotypes and biases about my brothers and sisters. And what I've learned to do is when that happens is to recognize it and to not act on it. Just like I have to do around race and gender and GLBT. So in this liberal household, you know, being explicitly non-racist, the Vietnam War started, and I got involved in the anti-war movement because for a lot of us boomers, we believe that the United States should live up to its ideals, the thing that it says it says. We're really pretty obnoxious about that kind of stuff. You know, it's like, okay, you say justice for all. Well, where is the justice for all kind of thing? You know, we could be real doctrinaire and a real pain in the ass. So the Vietnam War was one of those kinds of things where it really didn't make any sense to a lot of us. So I got involved in the anti-war movement and got a lot of experience in everything from how to use a mimeograph machine to picketing and organizing. But it started to get pretty tough in the LA area. You know, you could go on a big march and it was all right, but there were times when using crutches and being vulnerable was kind of dangerous, you know, with the police, the way they handled demonstration in those days. So anyway, I moved up to Sonoma State and kind of forewent any of my political stuff, and I had a disability consciousness, and it's something I've realized the last 4 or 5 years is that I realized that no, that's not the one. That I thought of myself in some ways as a disabled person in a way that actually, let's go back even a little bit further. So there are some people who here is a shoe, a boot that Frida Kahlo had made for herself and that she decorated. It's bright red and it goes to about mid-calf, and it has some very pretty applique on the toe. So there's people like Frida Kahlo who are documenting their disabilities, but it's not from a broader political sense. You know, she was very political. She was communist, but she didn't see her disability necessarily as political. And I was similar. One of the things that I did in the there we go. I want to share this. Here's a photo I took of myself, had my brother take, and it shows me sitting on my wheelchair, holding a bottle of beer, wearing cutoff Levi's and my full leg braces, along with black pointed cowboy boots, showing my tattoo and looking rather like a tough guy. And so I took this in 1972, 73, before I had a disability consciousness, but I was playing around with disability imagery. And so I was starting to, in ways that I didn't even realize, recognize who I was as a disabled person. We get up to about 1973, 1974, and I'm kind of looking at my disability identity a little bit every now and again when I meet Steve Diaz. And Steve Diaz was a wheelchair user, and he was the first disabled person who I met who was hipper and cooler than I was. That was enormously important to me. Being cool was really important, and I'm afraid still is. So to meet a wheelchair user who was hipper and cooler than I was meant that I could take on an explicit disability identity. And I'm talking about all of this identity stuff because that's my social justice beliefs in disability come out of that personal experience and that personal identity. If I have shame about my disability and want to hide because of my disability, I'm not going to be political. What I need to do is to embrace my disability, embrace my community, embrace my brothers and sisters with disabilities. And that's where the strength of the politics comes in. So David talked about some of the about the 504 demonstration. And let's see if this works. Yeah, there we go. So there's the picture of Steve Diaz with his long hair and the "We Shall Overcome" sign. And this was at the 504 demonstration. There have been a lot of demonstrations in San Francisco up until this point, in particular, Judy Heumann. How many of you have seen Crip Camp? Irene, how many people in the room are raising their hand?
We got about 5.
Okay. Your homework assignment when you leave this talk today is to go to Netflix or YouTube and watch Crip Camp. Because it's an essential discussion of the disability rights movement. So some of the first disability rights had to do with, particularly in the United States, had to do with employment. So in 1917, there was a employment of people with disability, veterans with disabilities, laws on the books. But in general, there was very little support for people with disabilities. Oh, good. Somebody posted the YouTube. And there's very little legislation. There was, beginning in the 30s, entitlement programs for people with disabilities that started with Helen Keller. We were seen as people who were needy, people who were pitiful in some ways, people who, there's a view called the needy poor, where it wasn't our fault that we had a disability, so we needed to be supported by the government. It was all the kinds of things that I really didn't want to be involved in until I met Steve Diaz. Part of what I think I woke up too early this morning. I wanted to make sure that I got here on time, so I got up earlier than my regular time. So with this view of people with disabilities as being, the worthy poor, I didn't want any part of that, but the politics of it, that made a lot of sense to me. And that's when I felt like I came home to my community. And that coming home, was an important thing to me. That sense of community, a sense that I had a place. So all those years, those 20 years growing up, not identifying as a disabled person or knowing any other disabled people, was incredibly lonely. So to come home to the disability community and to have a community was incredibly important to me. So we started getting together. Steve and I started the disability program at Sonoma State University. Judy Heumann, who, if you've seen Crip Camp, you know who she is. If you haven't, you need to know who she is. There's two strains in the disability political movement and the disability social justice. One is the Berkeley story, and that's a bunch of disabled people, severely disabled people, who were going to UC Berkeley and who started organizing. They're called the Rolling Quads, and Ed Roberts was one of them, and a bunch of other people. And they eventually started the Center for Independent Living. Actually, they started one of the first social justice college programs, the Physically Disabled Students Program at UC Berkeley. And then they started the center. They graduated. It's something that many of you will do and go out into the world. I never did. Once I graduated, I made sure I got a job at Sonoma State. So I never had to leave the university until I was 50 years old. But so the Berkeley folks took a lot of the politics from Berkeley and the coalition building to form their view of the disability rights movement. Judy Heumann on the East Coast took a lot of racial justice and the labor movement and coalition building. And eventually she came out to Berkeley to work at CIL with Ed Roberts. And together, the two of them in particular, formed these coalitions. And instead of being, March of Dimes, which was dealing with polio, or the Muscular Dystrophy Association, which was very medicalized, was very single disability focused, what we were doing was much more social justice and coalition building. And so it was multi-disabilities. Except, of course, for people with intellectual disabilities. We still had so much ableism, and particularly about intellectual disabilities. So that program at Berkeley was called the Physically Disabled Students Program. We didn't recognize learning disabilities or being on the spectrum or intellectual disabilities that time. We've gotten a whole lot better about it. By the time the 504 demonstration came around, it was all disabilities. So let me show you a few pictures of hang on a second. There we go. Excuse me. I'm having a little bit of trouble with, there we go. So I'll show you a few more pictures of the demonstration. I took a roll of film that day at the federal building, and it's the best roll of film I ever took. I mean, there so many of these photos are. So one of the rolling quads was Hale Zukas, who's in the center of this picture using a head pointer. And Hale was an advocate for increased transportation and was really a major force around accessibility and transportation. So I took this roll of film, best roll of film I've ever taken. You know, there's lots of good pictures here. And all of a sudden, the last couple of years, it's gotten popular. So the Getty Archive has these photos up now. I'm talking tomorrow morning with the public broadcast, PBS. The one of their shows wants to use my photos. So, you know, it was a pretty broad group of people. There's Reverend Vernon Cox, who has founded the Marin Center for Independent Living. And here's Steve with actually flirting with another one of the demonstrators. Here's the one photo of mine that was used in Crip Camp. That's Ann Coppola, who's still around. I'm friends with her. So it was a demonstration like, I mean, we're used to demonstrations, you know, the African-American civil rights movement really taught us a lot about how we can, how to demonstrate. Even the Dennis Billups, who was there, who's an African-American, would talk about help people sing the songs that were used in the African-American civil rights movement, you know, and translate them for the disability community. You know, there's things like "We Shall Not Be Moved" and, you know, Steve's sign that said "We Shall Overcome." You know, we borrowed a lot from the African-American community and their struggle. It was when people in Berkeley and people from the East Coast came together in a coalition in the late 60s, early 70s, that the disability rights movement really took off. And since then, you know, we've gotten the ADA in 1990. You know, we've gotten a lot of legislation. There's been a lot of changes. We are, though, like other marginalized groups who start getting their civil rights, we actually become less happy as we get more rights. And that's because we get our civil rights, we get some civil rights, the world starts opening up to us. We look around and go, this is great, but wait a second, there's a lot more to be done. So we open up the world a little more, and then we look around and go, wait a second, there's a lot more to be done. So that's still true today. You know, our employment situation is not good. You know, there's still a lot of prejudice in the business world about disability and what people with disabilities are capable of. You know, we're still not recognized as bringing as an asset to the workplace. I mean, all disabled people I know are incredibly resourceful and creative to be able to get our needs met. You know, that my use of tools, you know, and being able to take something like a pencil and turn it into a useful tool, you know, so I can pick up something off the floor. You know, I've got what now? 72 years of experience of doing that. You know, I think that's an asset. So I could talk a bunch more. I will talk a bunch more if nobody asks any questions. So let's see what people got to say. What do you want to know?
I've got a microphone here if anybody has a question.
Anybody? Anybody?
And I can also convey anything that goes into the chat, or you can also raise your
Cool.
hand if you wanted to speak.
I do have one over here too.
Don't have a question necessarily, or you want to say? Hello there, I'm Rodana, I'm a student in BBC. My professor recommended me staying after class. And I would like to say, I think it's very inspiring, how you came up along. And I think it's really great that we are openly talking about our disabilities. It honestly means a lot. I have a lot of people in my family with disabilities. So it hits home. I myself really do feel for the people, and I wish I can help people all the time. I was offer help because I know people could struggle with things and they usually don't talk about it much. Sorry. Seeing those photos, it kind of hit home because I have family members who can't drive because of their disabilities. And it's very hard for them. So I think it's great that you're talking. And I think it's honestly very great that everyone's here. I've noticed a lot of people are actively listening, and it's very beautiful. I honestly would stay again, and I genuinely did enjoy you talking, and I enjoyed your pictures. I think it's very great that you still have those pictures. Very inspiring, very beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that I never talk about is how hard it is. You know, I mean, it is not easy having a disability, you know, for sure. One of the things that I do is I helped organize a spinal cord injury support group. You know, we meet monthly. And you know, I know full well our lives can be tough. You know, and part of that toughness is that we live in a world that's not always supportive or hospitable to us. But it's also our lives can be tough because just having a disability can involve a lot of pain and you know, various problems just in and of itself. You know, it's not a bed of roses by any means, but you know, what keeps me going is you know, is my community, and is this sense of, you know, one of the things that I've learned too, you know, as I see people age around me, as my friends and relatives, you know, we all start getting disabilities of various sorts, so we all share that. But you know, the human condition is not easy, so it's not just disability, but you know, I have my own unique things. So you know, I focus on the stuff that brings me joy, the stuff that fulfills me. One of the things that I'm doing these days is taking a lot of pictures in the you know, of disabled people and in the disability community. You know, so what I'm showing here is a graduation from Manley High. My goddaughter was graduating, and you know, there's wheelchair user there, and I wanted to show that, and to you know, a friend of mine likes this picture because it shows this ramp that kind of leads to nowhere, you know, and in some sense, that's a analogy for us. Here's a disability. I took a picture I took at the Disability Pride Parade in San Jose, and the current head executive director of MCIL is Eli Gillardin, and that's the guy taking a picture of me as I take his picture. Very meta there. And I can't remember the name of the young woman in the foreground, but you know, here's a bunch of disabled people who are coming together on a sunny day, you know, to celebrate disability pride. There's Ann Coppola again. She's got gray hair by now. And I like this picture a lot because two things. One is it's shot at the same level as Anne and Denise. Because I'm using a wheelchair, so I'm at the same level as they are. Because most pictures of people with disabilities are shot from a standing position, shooting down at us. But I'm also showing something that the world doesn't see very often, which is one disabled person comforting another. This is at a memorial for Michael Winters. And you know, they've been pals. They're both in Crip Camp, so when you see it, or if you've seen it, you can recognize them. You know, they've been friends for a long time, and to show them, you know, one being able to comfort the other, that's not what we usually expect. And so I like showing, you know, that our community is like other communities, you know. And then I was giving a talk, and so a colleague of mine, Lake Cowell, was sitting there in the front row using her wheelchair. And it was a fun photo to take with another disabled person. They're comparing their phones. So these days I'm focusing on community as much as possible, you know, and also on culture. You know, it's, you know, you're not going to find me on the picket line these days. Mostly where you're going to find me is in the art world, because there's a lot of work being done on the politics of things. You know, there's a lot of people fighting for our rights. Where my passion is these days is it seems to me that we can use the arts to help change people's opinions and views and biases about those of us with disabilities. There's something about the arts oftentimes that can get past, you know, our thinking, our intellectualizing about things. And so we can use the arts to have a different kind of perspective on disability and to illustrate it for the dominant culture in a way that it's really hard to do otherwise. You know, so there's a lot of filmmakers out these days. You know, there is support for them. You know, it's I mean, not a lot, of course, but Jim Lebrecht was able to get a fair amount of support for Crip Camp. He lives in the Bay Area. He lives in Berkeley. Very nice guy. So that's mostly what I'm doing these days, you know, is my art and to support other people in the arts. And we're making some headway. The San Francisco Museum of Art, Modern Art, purchased a couple of paintings from Creative Growth and has a big exhibit right now of them. So somebody asked a question, what's the most surprising thing I have learned, discovered during the most surprising thing? What I spent so long thinking I was not part of a disability justice community. It really kind of surprised me to find that I shared a similar experience with African Americans who are in their civil rights struggle. You know, and it still kind of surprises me, you know, that I share with other marginalized communities, you know, that sense of being a part of a social justice movement. You know, it's really pretty exciting. You know, maybe the other thing that really surprised me was that I am a disabled person. You know, Lawrence Carter Long these days is talking about language. And one of the things that he's harping on a lot is to use the term disabled or disability. You know, what he says is use the word. You know, it doesn't person first or identity first. It matters less than actually using the word disability. And so I think we've done a much better job of that. Where we're not doing a very good job, but I noticed continually around here in our local newspaper is kids with disabilities who are in the public schools. You know, it's always called special ed and kids who have special needs. You know, and the argument is they're not special needs. Those kids have the same needs as anybody else. There's barriers to them getting those needs met that are different than other students, but they're not special needs and they're not special kids. And save me from Special Olympics. You know, the Paralympics is just, I find it mind blowing that how much attention was paid this year in the Paralympics. I mean, there was coverage in our mainstream papers. I mean, it used to be that you couldn't see video of the Paralympics, and now you can. I don't pay for NBC Sports, but I guess if I did, I could see just about everything. You know, I find that amazing. You know, and it's very cool. And the Paralympics are about, you know, there's not much special about them. You know, they're athletes, you know, with a variety of disabilities who are competing.
Anthony, if you don't mind, I have a question as well.
Please, please.
So you have an advantage over, I think, almost everybody else in this room in that you were around for the very early part of the disability justice movement up to the present day. And I'm curious what you would say is the biggest change you've noticed during that 50-year time period.
In some ways, it's surprising how little things have changed. You know, it's still, the movement feels like it's the same as it always was. You know, with a variety, it's just like any political movement. You know, there's various factions. You know, there's conservatives, there's liberals, there's progressives, there's radicals. And that hasn't changed a great deal. What's changed, we've become much more sophisticated about who we are. We've also become much more sophisticated about what we share with other movements. In the beginning, I don't think we understood that at all. You know, and in some ways, we still don't. I mean, I heard some serious racism still going on in the disability community, which is really disconcerting to me. But I think in general, we've gotten much more sophisticated. And it's thinking back to when the ADA was signed, 3,000 disabled people were invited to the White House to see the signing of it. And that was probably I got invited. I didn't go for foolish reasons. But if they invited me, that meant they'd gotten down to about the third tier of political activists. So that there probably wasn't more than about 5,000 of us in the United States who were working for social justice, for disability social justice. These days, you know, there's hundreds of thousands, I believe. You know, so the movement's grown, and it's grown a lot. What's really changed is just the level of access that I've got these days, the level of recognition. You know, it used to be a tremendous amount of work for my wife and I to go on vacation, to arrange hotel stays or motel stays. You know, and when you said, well, do you have a wheelchair accessible room? You know, they go, oh, yes, no problem. There's only a couple of stairs. Well, a couple of stairs when you use a manual wheelchair means it's not accessible. You know, so you'd have to tell people, well, get your tape measure and go measure the width of that bathroom door. Now, when I travel, you know, do you have an ADA room? Yeah, we do. Okay, fine, book it for me. You know, so life's a lot easier in many ways. I used to travel a fair amount, and you know, I couldn't rent a car that had hand controls, you know, and then I could. You know, it made life a lot easier. So, and I think the last couple of years, I mean, I think Crip Camp changed everything in terms of it opened up people's recognition of disability in a way that nothing else has. I mean, considering I get at least a phone call a month, if not more, of people wanting to use my photos and to find other photos of people with disabilities. And generally what I do is I use that as an opportunity to give people a disability 101, just kind of like, here's our history, here's who we are. And they're usually pretty grateful for that. So somebody, Carrie's asking, what was my K through 12 experience like before IDA or 504? It was lonely. It was really lonely. You know, it was you know, because I was different. I knew I was different, but I tried to pretend I wasn't different and tried to ignore the fact that I was different. I was enormously lucky. And I think also, I'm sure it has to have something to do with how I was raised. But I wasn't teased much in K through 12 in elementary school. You know, it was, I got a little bit of teasing, but no more than anybody else, and certainly not, nothing sustained. The kids that I went to elementary school with, Foursquare was one of the games they played on the playground. And they changed the rules enough so that I could play. You know, and I wasn't a great player, but, you know, I could do okay. You know, and the rules they changed was I got, what, 2 outs or 3 outs before I was out. You know, and so I was accommodated a little bit, not a lot, but enough. You know, so I think things have changed for kids. That, you know, I'm sure it's not nearly as lonely, but there's still a lot of prejudice against disability. So I'm sure that it's hard in many ways for disabled kids in K through 12. You know, but not having been there, I don't, you know, I'm not sure whether that experience better or worse than mine. That helps?
Yes,
I
it does. Go ahead, Maureen. Sorry.
Sorry, I have a question from the audience here. I've got an English class of about 30 people with me, and they've been reading Judy Heumann's book. And they were wondering if you'd like to comment on Judy Heumann herself, or the book, or Crip Camp, anything about Judy Heumann.
Damn. I knew I'd get caught up. I haven't read Judy's book. My wife did. She hit the high points. I mean, the one thing. Okay, one of the first things I did when I bought her book, I mean, of course I bought it, was to look in the index and see if I was listed. I wasn't. Judy and I were pals because we went back to the beginning. She, you know, I met her when she was working at CIL. She and Ed eventually went to WID, and I knew her there. We always got along good. Judy was very inclusive around people with disabilities. So if you're a member of the tribe, she was there with you. And so it was she was really good about that. It was really I very much appreciated that. And my favorite recent Judy story is there's an exhibit at the Ed Roberts campus. I don't know if are you guys familiar with the Ed Roberts campus? Oops.
I'm getting mostly no.
Oh, okay. There it is. I've got a picture of the share screen. So here's the ramp that goes from the first floor to the second floor in the Ed Roberts campus. The Ed Roberts campus is in Berkeley, and it's right above the Ashby BART station. And it was created for the various disability organizations in Berkeley and Oakland to be all under one roof. And it pretty much worked out that way. There's a couple of organizations that weren't able to make it, but many of them were. And it's this wonderful building. If you're ever down there, go there, because it's just, I was expecting kind of a storefront, and what I found was a temple of disability, and to have this huge ramp going up to the second floor. And the photos in the background there were part of Patient No More, which was an exhibit that the San Francisco State did about the 504 demonstration. So that's my photo on the left there. And then straight ahead is the photo taken by Holland DeLille, who was a disabled photographer who documented the 504 and took over 900 photos. So anyway, Patient No More had an exhibit at the San Francisco Library, the main library, and Judy came out for that. And there's at one point where she's giving me the look, and I took a photo of that and I posted it on Facebook, and I mentioned that not only was Judy very inclusive, and you felt her warmth and her charm, but also Judy Heumann made sure you knew that you had a job to do to advance the cause, always. That's why so many people showed up at the 504 demonstration in San Francisco, is because Judy told us to. And there's times when I didn't show up for when Judy told me to, but I showed up for that. So anyway, I posted this picture of Judy, in what it would have been, not 19, but 2020, giving me the look. And I mentioned the look, and a blind colleague posted, she said, you didn't have to be sighted to know that Judy was giving you the look, which I thought was a great example of just what a powerful organizer Judy was. Somebody had a question in the chat, which longish, there it is.
And Anthony, I wanted to let you know we have about 5 minutes left, so we do have time for
Oh, okay, God, you're right.
We have about time for one more question if anybody wants to finish it off for us.
So somebody asked a question about the problem with ADA rooms in hotels not meeting their needs. Always. I mean, at least I can get into the bathroom in my wheelchair, that I may not be able to reach the shower thing, but nonetheless, it's better than it was, but our expectations are a lot higher than they used to be. So that's where we are. It's a struggle. We're still trying to figure this stuff out. And we're also trying to meet the needs of a disparate community. The disability community, what I need versus what somebody who's hard of hearing or deaf needs, versus somebody who's blind. I mean, it's hugely different, and how do we all live together and how do we all have access? We're figuring this stuff out little by little.
Go ahead, Irene.
I know we're pressed for time, but we have one more student with the question, if that's okay.
Please.
Okay, I'll make it quick. I assist,
I have a question.
Okay, let's go with this student first, so we can get to you later.
hello. My day job is to assist clients who are developmentally disabled. So I have a question so I took them to bowl and the manager there was so nasty, it infuriated me. And we were discriminated against. So my question would be, what advice would you give me to help people like that? Because when I tell you I was so mad, right in my statement, I couldn't even see straight, but I had to watch my behavior because I'm representing the company I work for and the clients I represent. So any advice?
Yeah. That's it. We learn patience, and we learn to put up with jerks. And it's, I mean, there's a lot of advocacy you can do. You can, write letters to the owner of the bowling alley. Somebody's hired this guy. You probably not change his behavior or opinions, but if his boss says something, it might help. Sometimes you just walk away. Sometimes it's like, there's nothing I can do about this jerk. I'm just going to ignore it and go on with my day, and as much as possible, not let it, bring me down, even though it hurts.
Anthony, I think we're going to wrap it up on that as a final thought. Thank you once again so much for joining us today. And
Thank you.
For sharing your experiences and your knowledge about the history of the movement.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
I'll keep up the good fight.
Yeah.
Community colleges do a great job in helping out the various communities. Cool.
All right. Bye-bye, Anthony. Thanks again.
Bye. Thank you.
All right.